AWS has 200 plus different services, but is it necessary to learn all of them? No. In this video, I'll be sharing with you the most important AWS services you should know as a DevOps engineer. Let's go. Hey everyone and welcome to Cloudchamp. In this video, we will be discussing the most essential AWS services that every DevOps engineer should know about. As a DevOps freelancer, I've been working with so many different companies that use AWS. So I can tell you that the services we will be discussing in this video are one of the most commonly used and important services in DevOps. To help you better understand this topic, throughout the video, we will be exploring different services, discuss their real use case, and categorize them in different DevOps fields like infrastructure, networking, monitoring, security, containers, and more. So let's get started. Let's start with the fundamental services that every company uses. Number one is VPC. So VPC or Virtual Private Cloud is a networking service in AWS that lets you create your own private network in the cloud where you can deploy your servers and databases in secure and isolated manner. As a DevOps engineer, it is important to know VPC because it is usually the first thing you will be creating when starting a new project. So as a DevOps engineer, you should have knowledge of subnets, route tables, internet gateway, NAT gateway, and how to create a VPC. Second fundamental service is EC2 or Elastic Compute Cloud. EC2 is a service that lets you create virtual servers in the cloud. You can create servers of different operating systems and different sizes having CPU and RAM. When you launch a server, you can define network settings, storage, and more. So a DevOps engineer should know how to create a server because usually when you work as a DevOps engineer, you will be asked to set up a server for setting up database, web applications, batch processing, and more. So a DevOps engineer should know how to launch a server and different features of EC2 like load balancing, auto scaling group, security groups, key pairs, and more. Number three is S3 or Simple Storage Service that can be used to store unlimited amount of data. S3 is generally used to store images, files, videos, or any kind of data. And a DevOps engineer should know how to use S3 because a company can be using S3 bucket to store their customer data, log files, or database backups. So you should have knowledge of S3. Next is Amazon RDS or Relational Database Service, which is a managed service that lets you create, set up, and operate databases in the cloud. RDS supports 6 popular database engines, which are Amazon Aurora, MariaDB, MySQL, Microsoft SQL, and more. Due to its different features, many companies are using RDS as their production database, and that is why every DevOps engineer should know RDS. Next important service is IAM or Identity and Access Management, which allows you to manage access to your AWS resources. Using IAM, you can create and manage users, groups, and roles to control who can access specific resources and actions. As a DevOps engineer, it is essential to know IAM because you need to ensure that only authorized users can have access to your critical resources like EC2 instances, S3 buckets, or RDS databases. Now let's look at some CICD services that AWS provides us. So CICD is an important process in DevOps that automates building, testing, and deploying of the code. AWS provides you with different CICD services. Number one is Code Commit. So Code Commit is a fully managed source control service similar to GitHub or GitLab where you can store your application code. As a DevOps engineer, you should know Code Commit to store your code, track changes, and to collaborate with other developers. Number two is Code Build. So Code Build is a fully managed build service that compiles the source code, runs the test, and produces a software package that is ready to deploy. As a DevOps engineer, you should know Code Build because it allows you to quickly and easily build and test code changes, enabling for more faster and frequent software releases. Number three is Code Deploy, which is a deployment service that automates software deployments on various compute services such as EC2, Lambda, or Fargate. A DevOps engineer will be using this service to deploy web applications and microservices. A DevOps engineer should know Code Deploy because it enables you to automate deployments, reduce downtime, and ensure consistency in the deployment process. Next important CI/CD service in AWS is Code Pipeline. So Code Pipeline is a continuous delivery service that helps you automate your release pipelines for more faster and reliable application updates. Code Pipeline can be integrated with different CI/CD tools like GitHub, Jenkins, and other AWS services like Code Deploy and Code Build. A DevOps engineer should have knowledge of Code Pipeline to automate the deployment process, resulting in more faster and reliable releases. After CI/CD, let's look at some networking services in AWS. The two important networking services that a DevOps engineer should know are VPC and Route 53. We have already talked about VPC, so let's look at Route 53. Route 53 is a DNS service in AWS that lets you register domain names for your applications or websites. And you can also create and configure DNS records that can route traffic to your AWS services such as EC2, load balancers, S3 buckets, and more. A DevOps engineer should know how to use Route 53 to register domain names, create DNS records, set up health checks, and also failover routing policies. After networking services, let's look at some database services in AWS for DevOps engineers. The three main database services are RDS, DynamoDB, and Elastic Cache. We have already seen RDS in the essential services. So using RDS, you can create SQL databases like MariaDB, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and more. Now let's look at DynamoDB. DynamoDB is a very popular NoSQL database that is very fast and highly scalable. A lot of applications use DynamoDB, so every DevOps engineer should know how to work with DynamoDB. Elastic Cache is an in-memory database that is used to store frequently accessed data, session data, and metadata. For example, an e-commerce website can be using Elastic Cache to store frequently accessed data of product or customer information, reducing the number of calls on database and thus improving the performance of the application. So a DevOps engineer should know Elastic Cache to improve application performance and to reduce database load. After database, let's look at some infrastructure as code service in AWS. So in AWS, you have a service named as CloudFormation, which is infrastructure as code service that lets you manage and provision AWS resources such as EC2, S3, Lambda, RDS, anything in the form of code. Not only this, CloudFormation also supports third-party infrastructure as code tools such as Terraform. So a DevOps engineer should know how to work with CloudFormation, how to create CloudFormation stack, templates to provision and manage AWS services in the form of code. Now let's look at container services in AWS. Due to rise of Docker and Kubernetes, every application is deployed in the form of containers. And AWS offers you with different container services such as ECR, ECS, EKS, and more. So let's discuss all these container services in this section. Number one is ECR or Elastic Container Registry, which lets you store, manage, and deploy your Docker container images in ECR. A DevOps engineer should know how to use ECR to deploy the Docker container images in private and public registry and to use them with other AWS services such as ECS and EKS. ECR is similar to Docker Hub, but it's a service in AWS. Number two is ECS or Amazon Elastic Container Service, which is a container orchestration service that lets you run, scale, and manage your Docker containers on the cloud. First, you will be pushing your application image on ECR and then using ECS to deploy them in the form of container. ECS supports two different launch types, EC2 launch type and Fargate launch type. Using EC2 launch type, you will deploy your Docker containers on EC2 servers, whereas using Fargate, you will deploy your Docker containers in serverless fashion. As a DevOps engineer, you should know ECS to deploy your application, ensuring high availability and reliability. Next is Amazon EKS. So if a company wants to deploy their containerized application on Kubernetes cluster without managing any Kubernetes architecture, then they can use Amazon EKS. So Amazon EKS stands for Elastic Kubernetes Service that lets you manage and deploy applications on Kubernetes cluster, which is going to be managed totally by AWS. So a DevOps engineer should know how to create clusters, how to create node groups, how to deploy their applications on these Kubernetes cluster, because every company is using Kubernetes and you should know this. Next, let's look at monitoring services in AWS. So monitoring is very important aspects of DevOps to check the status and health of your application. AWS provides with different monitoring services. Let's look at two important monitoring services that you should know as DevOps. So number one is CloudWatch. Amazon CloudWatch is a monitoring service in AWS that lets you collect and track metrics, log files, and set alarms. So if you have an application which is showing you high CPU usage and going down, you can use CloudWatch for that. With CloudWatch, you can collect metrics like CPU usage, memory utilization, network traffic, disk I/O, and create alarms to alert when certain thresholds are met. So CloudWatch is a good tool to collect real-time monitoring of EC2 servers, EKS, S3, or any AWS service. A DevOps engineer should know how to use CloudWatch to set up alarms, track metrics, and to troubleshoot error whenever there's an issue. Number two is CloudTrail. Imagine you're working at a company and someone deletes a production database. How would you know who has deleted it? You can do it using CloudTrail. So CloudTrail is an AWS service that will log all the API calls made in that account. Using CloudTrail, you can audit and monitor your AWS resources and detect security incidents. The CloudTrail can be used to monitor any kind of logs like creating instances, deleting S3 buckets, changing security group rule, or anything. So a DevOps engineer should know how to use CloudTrail because it can help them track and troubleshoot issues or any security breaches. Now let's look at automation services provided by AWS. So automation is a very important part, and every DevOps engineer is going to automate all the repetitive tasks. AWS provides you with different automation services. Number one is Lambda. Lambda is a very popular serverless compute service which lets you run code without managing any servers. You can use Lambda to automate different workloads. So you can write the automation code and put it on Lambda, and you can trigger it on the basis of different events like adding something on S3 bucket or creating an EC2 instance and more. A DevOps engineer should know how to use Lambda to automate different workflows without managing any underlying infrastructure, which can reduce the complexity of these automation workflows. So you should know Lambda. Second important automation service is Systems Manager. With System Manager, you can automate operational tasks like patching, software deployment, or configuration management while collecting the data for future analysis and security practices. So a DevOps engineer should know how to use Systems Manager to manage infrastructure at scale and to gain insights on system performance and security. Next AWS service in automation is Elastic Beanstalk. So Elastic Beanstalk is a fully managed service to automate your deployment of applications. If you push your code on Elastic Beanstalk, it will automatically handle the deployment, provisioning of servers, load balancing, auto scaling, and more, letting you focus only on the code. A DevOps engineer should know how to use Elastic Beanstalk because it provides a simple way to deploy application without managing any infrastructure. Last but not the least, let's look at some security services in AWS. So two important services that every DevOps engineer use are KMS and Secrets Manager. Let's talk about KMS. KMS stands for Key Management Service, which lets you create and control encryption keys that can be used to encrypt any kind of data on the cloud. KMS can be used to encrypt S3 buckets, database backups, EBS volumes, and more. A DevOps engineer should know how to use and encrypt data using KMS because it is a critical component to secure data on the cloud. Second important security service is Secrets Manager. Secrets Manager is a service where you will be storing your passwords, database credentials, API keys, and other secrets. It also allows you to enable automatic rotation and integration with different AWS services. So a DevOps engineer should know how to use Secrets Manager and to store their secrets inside it so that you don't need to put them in your code and you can integrate them with your other AWS services as well. So there you have it, all the important AWS services you should know as a DevOps engineer. One thing to note is, while AWS provides you with so many different services, there can be open source alternative for many AWS services. For example, for CloudWatch, you have alternative service as Prometheus. For AWS Ops Work, you have Jenkins, and so on. So even though you have open source alternatives, if you learn all these services mentioned in the video, it will be very easy for you to work with those open source alternatives as well. So I hope this was very informative, and if you have any questions, any doubt, let me know in the comment section. If you think there is any AWS services I've missed, you can let me know, and that's it. Thank you and have a good day.